Tales from the Old Forest. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 2. The Acorn. Plentyn had heard the word splash before. Many people have. It's a classic example of onomatopoeia, the name we give to words which describe a sound like sizzle, hiss, smack, or roar. As Plentyn's body burst into the great river, though, he reflected that splash was completely inadequate when describing the sound his body made striking the surface of the water. Every instant of that moment was seared into his memory in glorious technicolor and stereophonic sound, and if Plentyn were asked to come up with a more accurate sound, he thought it might be something along the lines of "Kapawifum sha." But I suppose that's not really that catchy, so perhaps splash will have to suffice. In some strange way, the time while Plentyn had been in the air, plummeting towards the surface of the water, had been almost like slow motion. He somehow seemed able to take in everything around him. The small red-furred creature he was trying to save as it heaved for breath, the shouting form of Grandma as she yelled out fruitlessly behind him, a hare on the far bank that raised its head in shock at the noise, the birds frantically taking flight to escape the commotion. All that ended with that splash as he plunged into the river. The sudden cold drove the air from his lungs, and he let out a bubbling shout as his head was driven below the surface, before gasping in a great breath as he thrust his head back up, eyes still swiveling to find the creature he'd leapt in to save. "Oh, botheration!" cursed Grandma from her frozen position on the riverbank. "Well, that's gone and done it!" Plentyn was shocked to realize that even in this brief moment she'd fallen several paces behind him. No, of course that wasn't right. She hadn't fallen behind at all. Instead, he had surged forward, heaved by the hungry current of the river. Moving his arms and kicking hard to keep his head above water, Plentyn fought down a burst of panic at his situation and scanned the river again to find the red-brown flash of fur that would show him his target. As he bobbed up and down, he finally saw it a few meters behind him as the river drove them both downstream. A spike of fear seared through Plentyn as he saw the creature wasn't moving at all now, and its little eyes had closed, its head dropping under the water completely. Striking out against the current, Plentyn fought his way back through the flow, reaching out urgently to grasp hold of the desperate animal. But fighting a river current is hard work, and fighting against the current of the great river was nothing short of exhausting. Plentyn dragged and hurled his tired body through the icy water, not thinking a moment beyond needing to rescue the small form in front of him. He stretched out his shaking arm once, twice, a third time, and felt damp fur beneath his fingers. Grasping hold of the tiny animal in one hand, the other still struggling to keep him afloat, he held it high above his head and clear of the water, relieved to feel a straining flutter beneath his fingers as the creature sucked in small breaths. "Thank goodness," thought Plentyn, "it's alive." Unfortunately, Plentyn was now met with one of those moments that come to us all from time to time, when we have achieved the task that had wholly occupied our minds for a moment, and are then struck with the awful knowledge that there is more going on around us and we have new things to deal with, bigger things. In Plentyn's case, it was much bigger things, as the reality of his situation landed with him. Plentyn had found it hard to fight the current when he had all four limbs free to swim. Now, holding the rescued creature above his head with one hand, it was all he could do to keep his head above the surface as the great river dragged him on. The cold was setting into his arms and legs, and Plentyn could feel himself slowing down. Not good, he thought, not good at all. As he splashed and flailed as best he could, he stole desperate glances around, urgently looking for Grandma. She was nowhere to be seen. He must have left her behind, stranded upstream as Plentyn and the tiny creature were swept away. Somewhere in his hind brain, Plentyn felt he should probably be panicking right now, but somehow he couldn't summon the energy. He was, however, aware that the river had changed. Where before, the surface of the deep, powerful river had been smooth and silent, now it was flecked with white streaks as the calm surface was shattered. Scanning ahead, Plentyn saw that not far in front of him the river's course was broken by rocks, the current turning white with foam, and not far beyond that he seemed to lose sight of the river entirely. He could hear it, though. Where once the sound of the river had been soft and silent, now he could hear the deep, steady bass note of the water surging over a precipice and smashing down on the rocks below. A waterfall. Plentyn and his tiny passenger were hurtling towards a huge waterfall, and there was nothing, not a single thing that Plentyn could do to stop it. He looked around to see if there was any way he could help the creature, still held gently in his free hand. He considered trying to throw it to one of the banks, but the river was so wide here and the bank so high that he knew he would never get it clear, and the poor thing would only splash down into the icy depths again. "I'm so sorry," he gasped at the creature, his voice shaking and gulping with the cold. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." The last word ended abruptly, broken off like a snapped twig, as the cold, clawing at his chest, made its way to his throat. Plentyn shut his eyes and stopped fighting the current. Something struck his upraised arm hard. His eyes flew open and he was stunned to see a broad tree branch before him. It hadn't been there a moment before. He knew it hadn't been there a moment before. And yet here it was. Without him even thinking about it, his free hand shot out and grabbed hold of the branch, and he wrapped his other arm around it. He felt a pulling sensation along his whole body as the river fought greedily to keep hold of him, but he clutched hold of the branch and stayed steady. Tracing its path with his eyes, he realized it was a low-growing branch of a great willow tree bursting out of the riverbank. He had seen the tree before, but the branch had been high above him, reaching to the sky. "Come on, you daft wastrel," called a familiar voice from the riverbank. "That branch ain't there to be ornamental." In a moment of pure relief, Plentyn saw Grandma, her palm flat against the willow's trunk, staring down at him, a mix of emotions far too complex for Plentyn to follow in her lilac-green eyes. As he began to heave himself along the branch, he saw her turn back to the tree beside her, talking softly to it. No, it was too rhythmic for simple talking, more like chanting or even singing to it. Plentyn had no time to dwell on it, though, as the task in front of him claimed his full focus. Scrambling and scrabbling, the tiny creature clutched before him, he hauled himself up onto the branch and, as quickly as his shaking body would allow, clambered towards the safety of the bank. "You willful, headstrong blockhead of a boy," Grandma began, turning away from the tree to hold him in the full force of her glare. Despite her small stature, she somehow seemed to tower over him and almost inflated as she went on. "What, in the name of every tree in this great forest, were you thinking, hurling yourself into the river like that?" Plentyn gulped in a breath, keen to reply, but his voice was swallowed by the chattering of his teeth. It seemed his side of the conversation was only notional, though, because Grandma carried on regardless. "I almost lost you good and proper," the old woman chastised. "And then where would you be, eh? Right at the bottom of the falls is where." She barely seemed to take a breath before she carried on, but to Plentyn she seemed to be getting quieter, or possibly further away. There was a slight fuzziness at the edge of his vision, and he could swear it was getting dark. After a while, Plentyn was dimly aware that Grandma's tone had changed 1,000 miles away from him. He looked back at her. "Well," she asked him, "what do you have to say for yourself?" Plentyn knew it was a question, and he knew he should be able to answer, but he didn't seem to be able to focus his mind on the task. He blinked owlishly at Grandma, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. Through the sluggish haze of his muzzy mind, he saw her eyes change shape, the glare of a moment before, now a searching look of worry. "Plentyn?" she asked, her voice cut through with concern. He seemed to be looking at her through a tunnel now, his vision black around the edges, and he wasn't sure what to do next. A soft pushing nudged at his finger, and he flopped his head forward to look at his hands, both clutched tightly to his chest. From between his fingers, a small auburn head had pushed its way free and was sniffing the air timidly. In seeing this creature finally free and safe, a great weight seemed to lift off Plentyn's shoulders, and he felt suddenly light and free, like he was floating away. His knees seemed to be bending of their own accord, and Plentyn just had time to thrust his cupped hands towards Grandma, passing the small shape into her arms, before the world went dark, and he knew no more. When he came to his senses, it was dark. Not the darkness he had experienced earlier, where his exhaustion had closed the world around him. This was the fresh, cold dark of the forest at night. Before him, a fire snapped and popped merrily, and Plentyn felt a comforting weight on his shoulders. Looking down, he saw one of Grandma's great woolen cloaks was wrapped tightly around him. Above the familiar sounds of the forest at night, he could still hear the river surging behind him, and he finally realized that they were still where he had emerged from the water some time before. "Well, I didn't fancy carrying your bony body all the way back home," came Grandma's voice, as if she could read his thoughts. "Welcome back to the waking world, my lad. I'm glad to have you with us. How are you feeling, eh?" Plentyn took a moment to run a full-body system check, and was just about to open his mouth to answer "everything still seems to be attached," when a thought occurred to him. Looking around, he searched for the creature he'd gone to such lengths to rescue. "Where's the—" he began, but Grandma cut him off, drawing a small shape from within the folds of her robes. "She's here, lad, and well enough, though quite exhausted. I'm sure much the same can be said for you, eh?" Plentyn looked at the curled creature cupped tightly in Grandma's gnarled hand. Long, tufted ears tipped the tiny animal's head as it lay there sleeping soundly, its diminutive arms wrapped around its bushy tail. "A squirrel!" exclaimed Plentyn. It seemed like a silly thing to say. They both knew what it was, but it was the first time that he had actually found out what he had risked his life for. Looking at the exhausted animal, he had a deep sense of relief that it was safe. But then Grandma's words from the riverbank came back to him, and he realized what a panic he had put her through. "I'm sorry for what I did, Grandma," he began. But then he thought again. "Well, maybe I'm not. Not for saving this squirrel, I mean, but I'm sorry I put myself in danger." The old woman made no reply, but there was a sparkle in her eyes that he thought he recognized, and he knew she wanted him to carry on exploring the path his thoughts had led him on. "Perhaps I'm not sorry I put myself in danger. I mean, I couldn't have saved the squirrel without a bit of danger. But there were probably a lot of ways I could have been in less danger. I don't think I was thinking." "That's about right, my lad. You weren't thinking," the old woman interrupted. "Danger is unavoidable unless you live your life in a bubble, boy. But we must always be thinking, always, about exactly what danger is necessary and what danger can be avoided." She wasn't angry now. There was none of the chastising tone of before. But there was an urgent undertone to her words. She wanted him to learn a lesson, and she wanted him to learn it well. Plentyn sat up and looked her full in the face. "You leapt, without thought," Grandma went on. "Didn't look to me, didn't think to ask for help, just leapt into a situation far too big for you to handle. Were it not for that willow, there would have been 2 lives claimed by the river today." She didn't say any more, didn't labour the point. She could see that Plentyn had listened well and taken in her words, and there was no need to hammer in the lesson deeper. She nodded to him and picked up a dry branch from the pile before her, placing it into the fire. It popped loudly, and the tension between them seemed to break. "But I suppose," she went on, poking the fire with a long stick, "that I'd rather have you be a fool for the sake of kindness than ignoring the plight of those around you. It was a good thing that stirred your heart to action, lad, and I'm proud of you for letting kindness lead your way, even if you were a brainless blockhead with it." She grinned at him, and he grinned back sheepishly. The fire and Grandma's cloak were doing their work well, and Plentyn could barely feel any of the cold that had racked his body before. From somewhere to his left, a tawny owl hooted, and Plentyn was silent for a moment, seeing if he could hear it move from tree to tree. "That seems like a strange thing to jump into a freezing river for," he said after a while, not quite knowing where the thought was leading him. "I'm not sure if I was thinking kind thoughts, really. It just felt like the thing to do. I'd put that innocent creature in danger." He glanced down at the squirrel, still sleeping soundly. "And it was right that I should be the one to help." And you think that's not sparked by kindness, lad? Asked Grandma. I have known many a being without kindness in their heart, and many who carries kindness with them like a traveller carries a stick. Let me tell you, lad, it's only the ones who knew kindness who would ever put themselves at risk for someone they'd not met before, let alone a small creature like this, and she nodded towards the squirrel. Don't underestimate an act of kindness, Plentyn, my lad. It's more powerful than you will ever know. Powerful? Asked Plentyn, his tone etched with disbelief. It doesn't feel powerful, it's just being nice, he ended lamely. Nice? Replied Grandma, her voice dripping with incredulity. Nice? She asked again. Honey on toast is nice. Crocheted mittens are nice. Diving into a powerful river to rescue a perfect stranger from certain death is something else entirely. It's kindness, lad, plain and simple. It's a rarer thing than you know. Rare? Plentyn asked. Surely not. I mean, anyone can be kind, can't they? It's just part of you. We all have it, right? We all have capacity for it, Grandma agreed. But not everyone has the example. Kindness ain't something you're born with, it's something you learn. It's handed down parent to child, same as walking and talking. And it's a sad fact that just like children who ain't spoke to will never utter a word, them who ain't shown kindness won't know how to pass it on neither. She lapsed into silence, staring at the heart of the fire, and Plentyn thought she was seeing more than just flames there. He reflected on his own parents, wondering what lessons they must have taught him. I don't remember my parents, he began. Not really, anyway. I suppose that means the lessons they taught me are forgotten too. A deep sense of sorrow swept over him, as it always did when he tried and failed to recall his parents. He had expected Grandma to offer a word of sympathy or a warm hug, as she had done many times before. He had not expected the reaction she did give. Her carved earrings clicked together as she threw her silver head back and let out a great squawk of laughter, the beads and acorns tied into her braided hair bobbling back and forth. Plentyn looked at her confused, and from her chestnut skin those brilliant eyes sparkled with mirth. The lessons are forgotten, are they? She chuckled. I suppose you forgot how to speak, did you? How to eat? How to read? And who is it, do you suppose, taught you how to swim, eh? She gestured to the river, calling to mind his earlier efforts, and grinned at him infectiously. Plentyn felt his own mouth turning up as he realised how silly his question was. You've forgotten your ma and da up here, boy. She tapped the side of her head meaningfully. The skills they taught you? She patted her stomach emphatically. They're down here. The lessons they taught you. Her hand moved up to her chest, resting just above her heart. They live here. Not forgotten, never forgotten. Just not remembered is all. They lapsed into silence again as Plentyn let that sink in. I wasn't quite strong enough, though, was I? Plentyn ventured. I mean, I might have had a kind idea and leapt into the river like an idiot to carry it out, but I wasn't quite capable, you know? Grandma looked at him shrewdly, her head cocked to one side as she nodded gently. We all have to give out of what we have available, she began, and it's folly to try and give more. I can't promise a man a drink out of a well what's run dry, after all. In your case, I think you might have promised to fill the whole reservoir from a thimble of water you held between your fingers, she chuckled, and Plentyn grinned along with her. But the instinct was good, and we should never think there's any such thing as a lowly act of kindness. What do you mean? Plentyn began, but at that moment, a soft and sudden nudge against his finger drew his attention. Down to his side, the small shape of the squirrel was nuzzling against his finger with its nose. Plentyn had been so lost in his thoughts that he hadn't seen it moving from the folds of Grandma's robe, but here it was. Plentyn grinned warmly, staring down at the tiny animal, and turned his hand palm up. He had expected the squirrel to climb into his hand and sit there as it had done with Grandma, but instead it stared at his palm for a moment, then glanced up at his face and darted away into the darkness. Plentyn's face fell. Did I? He began. Just wait, Grandma encouraged. She'll be back in a jiffy. Once again, Plentyn was jealous of Grandma's ability to understand all the animals of the forest, but he waited as patiently as he could manage. Sure enough, as Grandma had promised, before long the sleek shape came dashing out of the dark, something small and shiny clutched between its teeth. As Plentyn watched, eyes beaming with delight, it scampered up to his still open hand. Taking the item from its mouth and clutching it between its paws, the squirrel placed it reverently into Plentyn's palm. Plentyn stared at it, lifting his hand slightly so he could see it better in the light of the fire. An acorn, still in its bobbled cap, deep brown and smooth. It was a simple thing. Plentyn had seen dozens, probably hundreds of them. This one, though, was quite different, quite unique, and quite the most precious gift he could remember being given in his whole life. Despite the warmth of the fire, his eyes burned as tears sprang to them, and he clutched the acorn tightly in his hand. He stared down at the squirrel, their eyes meeting properly for the first time, and he nodded softly. "Thank you," he said to the squirrel. He felt a bit silly saying something to the animal like that when it couldn't understand him, but it would have felt rude not to say something. To his great surprise, though, the squirrel bobbed its own head in a soft nod just like Plentyn's. "Gratitude." He didn't hear it, not like something you hear with your ears, but he heard a meaning, an intention, a feeling of sorts. He sat bolt upright in shock, his eyes opening wide. "Easy," Grandma cautioned. "Try not to get too agitated or you'll lose it." Plentyn's head whipped round to face her. "Did I?" he began. Did you?" "Yes, of course. I'm right here and she's right there." She nodded towards the squirrel, now following the conversation high above its head. "The way she's feeling so warmly to you, I couldn't help but hear her." "I can't," Plentyn trailed off, mouth gaping. He couldn't quite believe it. He'd always assumed that this was something he'd never be able to do, that this was some gift peculiar to Grandma and her strange magical ways. But then she'd never told him he wouldn't be able to communicate with the forest creatures, just that he didn't know how to listen proper. Well, now, Plentyn supposed, he must have been listening proper at long last. He clutched tighter to the acorn and stared down at the squirrel again. He opened his other hand and held it before the creature. She, as Grandma had pointed out, gave half a step of hesitation, then stepped nimbly into his palm. Plentyn raised her up in front of his face so the two of them met eye to eye, the small squirrel clutching her tail nervously in front of herself. "Thank you," he said to her again, this time not feeling foolish in the slightest. He looked her full in the face, trying to be as sincere and heartfelt as he possibly could, pushing all the feeling he could muster for the wonderful gift the squirrel had given him. "Thank you," he said again. He stopped then, waiting, trying to still his mind from its racing thoughts that might distract him from any reply that might come. Though his focus was on the small shape before him, he was aware of Grandma leaning forwards from across the fire. He could swear she was holding her breath in case she distracted him. Even the fire seemed to be burning more quietly. The squirrel bobbed slightly, hopping gently from foot to foot. "Welcomeness," came the reply. Again, it wasn't something he heard, more something he felt, a sense of something solid and real. He let out a small, choking laugh. For a horrible moment, he'd worried this would never happen again, though that first word was just a fluke, or even worse, he'd imagined it. But this meant it was real, really real. He'd really done it. He laughed again, the sound bubbling out of him like a mountain stream. From across the fire, Grandma barked out a laugh as well, and Plentyn saw tears in her eyes. "You did it, lad! You learned to listen," she crowed. "Oh, well done, my boy. I'm a picture of proudness and no mistake." Despite the noises that must have been huge and blaring to the small creature, the squirrel seemed undaunted and was glancing between them following the conversation. She danced from foot to foot again, but somehow seemed less nervous this time, more excitable. "Friendship?" came another sensation. "Oh, yes," agreed Plentyn, holding the squirrel at eyeline. "Oh, yes, indeed, it would be my pleasure to be your friend," he told her. "Friendship," the squirrel sent again, this time in confirmation. She took a hesitant step across his palm and then, ever so gently, pressed her forehead against the bridge of Plentyn's nose. For a moment, Plentyn was too shocked to react. But then he shut his eyes and enjoyed the moment for precisely what it was. He had the warmth of the fire, he had the magic of the forest, he had the love of Grandma, and he had a brand new friend. In that moment, life was truly good. Thanks for listening. Tales from the Old Forest was a Settle Stories commission. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Story editor was Miriam Sarin. Intro music was Adventure is Calling by Vens Adams. Outro music was Conquest of Paradise by Simon Folwar. It was a Parable Arts production.